So we've been talking about viruses, and viruses, we said, are infectious agents. We said that they are not comprised of cells, and therefore they're not living. So we refer to them as active or inactive. So there's another infectious agent that I want to spend a few minutes talking about, and those are prions. So prions as well are not cellular, so they don't have a cell at all. They do not have genetic information. There's no nucleic acids to them, and they are not capable of replicating themselves either. So these are what we call infectious proteins. So they're simply proteins, which is kind of odd to think about, right? It's a molecule, but it's infectious. So they cause a class of diseases that are called transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. And this basically destroys brain tissue. So prion diseases are rare, but they do have a worldwide distribution. So what happens is a normal prion protein is found within everybody's brain. We all have normal prion proteins. And when the protein misfolds, it can cause serious damage to the nervous system. So when a misfolded infectious version of the prion makes contact with the normal version, it causes changes to the normal protein's shape. So if you remember, proteins have very specific shapes that they take. They're very complicated shapes, and that helps to determine how they function. So the prion causes other proteins to misfold. So this leads to a kind of a chain reaction of all the proteins, all these prion proteins misfolding, and that spreads throughout the brain. And these misshapen proteins start to clump together, and they cause brain deterioration, which leaves holes in the brain. And that's what you're seeing in that image there. And that's why it's called spongiform, because the brain tissue looks like a sponge. It has all these holes or vacuoles in it. So you're seeing those kind of cleared out areas are the vacuoles that are in the brain tissue from these prions clumping together. And so it kind of pulls the tissue away. Now, some prion diseases are inherited, so or can be passed on. Some are genetic mutations that pop up, and others are acquired. So mad cow disease was a prion disease, or it still is a prion disease, that is spread through cows from one cow to another. And this was a big problem back in the 1980s, I think it was, where a lot of cattle in Europe had to be burned because they had these infectious prions. And then what was happening is these cows were then butchered, and the meat was then eaten by humans, and then it was causing human prions to misfold. So that became a big issue. There was also cases in 1985 where individuals acquired prions from human growth hormone, because human growth hormone at that time was derived from cadavers, right? If you want human growth hormone, you got to get it from a human. But now we genetically engineer cells to produce human growth hormone for us, so that way these prions are no longer spread through that route, right? So there's a lot that we can say about prions. There's very interesting stories about this, but I don't want to belay this too much, right? Because we're not going to be looking at it that much, but just so you're aware that there are infectious proteins. And then we have what are called satellite viruses. So this is kind of like having a parasite of a parasite, right? So we have satellite viruses, which are extraviral components that can affect the pathogenicity of a virus. So, and they may also alter the host range of a virus. So the satellite virus basically needs a host virus, because we said they're a parasite of a parasite. So they're a virus for a virus. So they're a virus that infects another virus, right? So the satellite virus needs a host virus to help it to move around and to help it replicate. Now, obviously, the virus cannot replicate the satellite virus. It doesn't have the parts to even replicate itself, but it's helping to direct the host cell to replicate the satellite virus, okay? So an example of this would be the Delta virus. So the Delta virus is the satellite virus for the hepatitis B virus, and it makes the infection much more severe when the Delta virus is around. Okay, so once again, don't want to talk too much about it, but just so you're aware that there are these things out there. So as it says, can make the symptoms more severe when these satellite viruses are there. Now, most viral diseases are kind of self-limiting and they don't require treatment. But others, obviously, such as HIV, requires therapy. So any step in the viral replication pathway could be used as a potential drug target, right? Potential way to get at the virus and to stop it. So we want to look at how the virus gains entry into the host cell. And that is kind of an essential point to look at for developing antiviral drugs. So studying how our own immune system successfully ends viral infections can also give us a model for how to produce antiviral treatments. So it's important to note that antiviral drugs usually only limit the infections rather than cure them. And that's because the viral pathogens exist inside of our host, of the host cell, right? So they exist inside us. So drugs cannot always reach them because they're already inside of our cells. Plus, the virus uses the cell's machinery to replicate itself. So once it's inside, you don't want to target the replication machinery, right? You don't want to target your own organelles because that's going to be a problem for you. So therefore, we have very few effective antiviral drugs because it gets to be very hard to find something that's effective only against the virus and will not affect our own cells. And this is why vaccines are so important. So vaccines basically train our immune system to recognize viruses, and it can help to limit the infection. So, after decades of research and development, we finally have some drugs that can help with hepatitis C that causes severe liver damage. We have vaccines for influenza, which protects millions each year, and newer vaccines to protect against HPV and chickenpox and rotavirus. So all these are now widely used. So it's much easier to prevent a virus than it is to treat a virus. Right? And another important thing to remember is that antibiotics are not successful at treating viral infections, right? Antibiotics only treat bacterial infections. So antibiotics, the way that they work is they're targeting cellular structures a lot of times that are unique to bacteria. And because viruses are not cellular at all, and they're completely different from bacteria, antibiotics don't work on viruses. So if you have a viral infection, you can't go to the doctor and demand antibiotics because it's not going to help you one bit. Now, if you got a secondary infection that's caused by a bacteria, then that could be useful. But if it's a viral infection, antibiotics are not going to work. And we'll get into how antibiotics work later on. All right, but just FYI that you cannot use antibiotics on a viral infection. And so this concludes our discussion on viruses. All right, so it's been lengthy enough, but there's a lot to talk about with these little critters.